Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lesson on the demographics and the people of Europe, in which we are going to be answering the essential question, what are the people of Europe like, as part of our Europe unit in World Social Studies. So the first thing we want to look about when we talk about Europe is what Europe's population is. So what I've done here is I've taken the population of the United States, which is 332 million, as a baseline number that you guys can use to kind of compare European countries to. So when we talk about Europe, there's all the countries in Europe, which would include Russia, put together, and that's 746 million people, so more than twice the population of the United States. If you're only talking about the European Union, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, the European Union is 447 million people, which is obviously about 110, 115 million more than the United States. So that number is important because of that number, the European Union has what we would call an economy of scale that it can use to compete with the United States. And if you want to know what that is, you can ask me in class. Just raise your hand. The largest countries in Europe, and we're talking population, the entire population of Russia is 146 million, but keep in mind Russia is a gigantic country spanning Europe and Asia. So when we get to population density, you may be a little surprised because Russia does have the most people of any European country. Germany comes in second with 84 million. The United Kingdom, also known as England, 68 million. France, 65 million. So the UK and France are approximately the same. Italy, 60 million. And Spain coming in at number 6 with 47 million. If you look at the chart on the right, the countries in orange and red have the most people, and the countries in green and the lower colors have fewer people. So the darker the color, the more people in those specific countries. So how densely populated is Europe? Well, there's total number of people, which I talked about on the previous slide, and then there's the population density, how many people per square mile or per square kilometer. When you think population density, you want to think how crowded is it? And of the large countries in Europe, Turkey actually has the highest population density. Turkey is in Southeast Europe, and it has 473 people per square kilometer. We're going to discuss things in metric because it's Europe and they use the metric system. I like this particular graphic over here because it compares the population density in each of these countries to a U.S. state so that we have something to compare it to. So the population density of Turkey is similar to that of California. Belgium and the Netherlands, called Holland, they're often called the Low Countries. They have very high population density. That's because they are fairly small countries with large populations. Now, remember the previous slide, I told you Russia had the most people in Europe. However, the lowest population density in Europe is Russia and the Scandinavian countries, such as Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Russia has the population density of Nebraska, known for its wide open spaces, and Norway and Finland have almost exact same population densities, so they relate to Maine, and Arkansas. None of those are very crowded states in the United States. Compared to that, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Poland, France, and Portugal, and Spain, they range from 270 people per square kilometer, which would be the United Kingdom, to just under 100 people per square kilometer in Spain. So I put those countries in order of most crowded to least crowded, but keep in mind Turkey is at 473, the UK starting at 270, significantly lower than Turkey. So please note, Russia has the highest population overall, but in terms of its population density, it has one of the lowest population densities. So, one question that pops out at me when I look at that, maybe it's something we can discuss in class, what role does climate play in population and in population density? Think about that. So, the next thing we want to talk about in Europe is language. And Europe has a multiplicity of languages. So our next essential question is, how does language affect Europe? And the first thing you need to know is that most of the present-day countries of Western and Southern Europe were part of the Roman Empire. So as we look here, this is Western Europe, and this is Southern Europe, that Winston Churchill once referred to as the soft underbelly of Europe. It should say Latin was the language of the Roman Empire. So I need to fix that slide, but I'll do that after this video. Latin was the language of the Roman Empire, and therefore language is what we call the mother tongue of 5 major languages in Europe, often called the Romance languages. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian all trace their origins to the Latin language. And those of you who speak Spanish, obviously, when you hear someone speaks French, Italian, Portuguese, or Romanian, I don't know how many of you have heard people speak about Romanian, you will notice that there are similarities to Spanish. However, the Romance languages are not the only languages in Europe. They would be represented by the color red here. Notice Romania is over here. But there are other language families in Europe. In addition to the Romance languages, most other European languages belong to language families that also have a mother tongue, such as Latin for the Romance languages. There are Germanic languages, and here's a news flash for you. English is descended from Germanic languages. There are Slavic languages. So Slavic languages are mostly in Eastern Europe. So that would be Polish, Czech, all of the Balkan countries, or at least some of them, influenced by Slavic languages. And Russia definitely sees itself as a defender of those who speak Slavic languages. There are Hellenic languages related to Greece, represented in orange. And there are Turkic languages influenced by Turkey in Southeast Europe. Those are the 5 big ones: the Romance languages, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Hellenic languages, and Turkic languages. So there may be lots of different languages under those umbrellas, shall we say, but those are the 5 major language families in Europe. If we're talking about just the European Union and all the countries that belong to the European Union has 24 official languages. And that is a challenge when you are an organization that is trying to unify a continent. Navigating language is definitely one of the big challenges, because here in the United States, we may have 50 states, but the primary overwhelming language is English, and the only secondary language we really have is Spanish, and that's spoken by 15% of the U.S. population. And of that 15%, a significant number of those people are at least bilingual. Now, many Europeans are multilingual as well. In fact, that's an expectation in the European education system, is you are going to know more than one language. That is not something that's even debated. So let's talk about how religion affects Europe. We know that the majority of Europe is Christian. The Catholic Church is based in Rome, which is in Europe. But let's do a deeper dive on that. Modern Europe is much less churched than other continents in the modern world. So what does that mean? That means that Europeans are not nearly as religious. Religion does not play nearly as large a role in their lives as religion does for people on other continents, including North America, where we live. In 313 AD, when the Roman Empire still existed, Emperor Constantine issued what is known as the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And back in that time, what we would consider to be the Catholic Church was pretty much the only game in town. It was the only Christian church. Two things changed that. The first is something known as the Great Schism, in which the Catholic Church, in yellow, was divided from the Orthodox Church in purple. And it was a schism because it literally divided the Christian world in half. Long story short, it was basically a disagreement over who should be Pope. Those people who are Catholic followed the Pope in Rome, and those people who wanted to be Orthodox followed the Patriarch, who at that point in time was in Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. Apologies to They Might Be Giants. So, Catholics in yellow, Protestants in blue. There was something called the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther formed the Lutheran Church, and that's when those people who considered themselves Christians, it started splitting into lots of different, what we will call denominations or subdivisions of Christianity. So the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church were your very large institutional churches. Henry VIII famously created the Church of England, the Lutheran Church, and obviously Christianity is split into lots of different subsects, S-E-C-T-S, since then. And of course, in the southern eastern portion of Europe is influenced by Islam because Turkey is a Sunni Islamic country. Turkey is what is left of the former Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire. Spain was influenced by Muslim invaders as well, known as the Moors. So there's a Muslim element in Spain. And then because of immigration, many people who have immigrated to Europe are Muslim and have brought Islam into Europe, which has definitely affected the politics and culture of Europe. All of these things are important to understand. So let's talk about the economy of Europe. What drives the economy of Europe? It's a very large continent. This is by no means universal. I can talk about certain areas of Europe, but Europe is an economically prosperous continent compared to many continents on the earth. Many countries in Europe are resource rich and others are not. So by resources, we're talking oil, gas, coal. We're talking precious metals. We're talking uranium. We're talking iron, the things we use to make stuff. Russia and Norway have enormous fossil fuel resources. So that includes oil, natural gas, coal. That pretty much is the entire basis of Russia's economy. And Norway does not belong to the European Union because it does not want to share the wealth it gets from the North Sea oil crude that fuels its economy and makes life for Norwegians very nice. Most countries in Europe have some form of precious metals, and they have raw materials that they extract from the ground. So down here where you see these symbols, this is all uranium extraction, and uranium is extremely important in nuclear power plants and, frankly, nuclear weapons. Highly enriched uranium. So most countries in Europe are highly industrialized and they have a manufacturing economy. Europe is obviously a huge tourist destination because of all the culture and architecture and that Europe is known for. So by working together and forming one market, the European Union And when we're talking about the European Union, we're talking roughly this part of Europe right here with some exceptions. For instance, Great Britain left. Switzerland was never part of the European Union. Norway hasn't joined the European Union for reasons I already talked about. But basically, this part of Europe is in the European Union. And the whole idea behind the European Union is that by working together and forming one market, it can act on a scale similar to the United States. So any individual European country going toe-to-toe with the United States couldn't really compete. But working together and having similar laws and trading policies and being consistent about those, Europe can basically act on a similar scale to the United States economically. Militarily, different story. More on that later. So last thing I want to talk about is immigration. How does immigration affect Europe? Often we think of immigration in the context of the United States and Mexico. Newsflash, folks, immigration is a global issue. So what we see here is the increase or decrease in the population of these European countries, and this is based on 2015 data, so it's almost 10 years old. But basically what you can see here is there are countries that people really want to move to: Spain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Norway, and places that people want to leave: Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and this is before the Ukraine war, Belarus. And you can also see that Russia's population is pretty much static. You can see that Finland's population is pretty much static. Portugal at 14.2. So there are places that people do want to move, and there are places that people don't want to move. So like the United States, Europe is a major destination for immigrants with many pull factors. Remember, pull factors are things that make people want to move to a new country. The UK, Germany, France, Spain, Sweden, and Norway are the most popular destinations for immigrants, many of whom come from North Africa, and many of them who were escaping from the Syrian civil war, which was at its height in 2015. That influx of new people has literally changed the complexion and composition of European societies to the point where immigration policy is a huge issue in elections in those countries. Because not unlike the United States, where there's been some pushback against immigration that plays out when we have political campaigns, in European countries, it is no different, except that Europe has a difficult history with immigration and treating people who are not native to certain countries as being lesser than. We could have a really deep and robust conversation about that if you'd like. The one thing immigration has also done is contributed to the dynamism of European economies. Immigrants move places because there are jobs, there's a need, and they want to contribute to the societies they are joining and add their skill sets. That is, for the most part, a positive thing for countries that accept immigrants. But, like I said before, it has also created tensions in the politics of those countries between those people who favor immigration and think it's good for their country versus those who want to protect the culture, language, and religion, and essentially the identities those countries have had: the Spanish identity of Spain, the French identity of France, the German identity of Germany, and feel that by having too many immigrants, those identities are somehow tarnished or damaged. So, what are the main takeaways from this lesson on the people of Europe? The first thing I want you to come away with from this introduction is that Europe is a very diverse and dynamic continent. It is one of the most diverse and dynamic continents on the earth and has had a huge impact on world history. European language and religion has had an enormous impact on the world, primarily because of colonialism and the colonial era that followed Christopher Columbus. And those colonies existed pretty much for 450 years. So to undo the impact of 450 years is simply not realistic. The economic power of Europe has drawn many immigrants who have changed European societies. Because Europe is so economically dynamic, many people want to move there, and when they move there, they have an impact on the societies they move into. Europe has a difficult history. 2 world wars and lots of wars before that between competing European powers. Europe is trying to learn from its history, and rather than competing with other European countries for who's going to be the big boy on the block, they're working together and saying, hey, if we work together, we can be a really big influence on the world economy and world politics and help all of our citizens prosper in peace rather than constantly worrying about war. Of course, as I record this, the Russia-Ukraine war is almost a year old, and it's the largest war in Europe since World War II. So obviously that's ongoing. Russia has a very different perspective on European integration. Russia is very threatened by European integration. Russia sees Europe working together economically and militarily as a way of trying to curb or prevent Russia from having power and influence. And Russia's perspective on these things is strongly influenced by its history of having been invaded by Napoleon and having been invaded by Hitler. Definitely affects the psychology of Russian citizens, and it definitely affects the psychology of the Russian government. More on that later. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that concludes today's introduction to the people and demographics of Europe. Hope you've enjoyed this lesson. And if you have any questions, now would be a wonderful time to ask. But other than that, this is Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the Blumendahl Teaching Channel.